U.S. terrorism list. And the United States begins funding rebel groups inside Iraq and arming them to overthrow this new government. Now, in this next period, up until 1989, the strategy of the United States was to make the Iran-Iraq war as miserable as possible for both the people of Iran and the people of Iraq, arming both sides secretly, providing intelligence to both sides secretly. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger said the goal is to make them destroy each other, so then the U.S., of course, would go into the rubble and ashes and, of course, regain access to its oil. Say Kissinger, a recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize, I think speaks to the reputation of that award. And at the conclusion of the Iran-Iraq war, the conclusion of the devastation, that very day, the United States began planning a war with Iraq and began conducting war games to train its soldiers to go to war with Iraq. And then began its campaign of bombings and sending 400,000 troops to Kuwait. Of course, when they prodded the Ba'athist government into invading Kuwait, as they got Kuwait to drop down the price of oil, decimating Iraq's economy, drilling underneath Iraq's border, stealing its oil, and then meeting with President Saddam Hussein, where Saddam Hussein said, look, I have to do something about Kuwait, or destroying our economy and stealing our oil, and that politician from Washington that met with him said, do what you got to do, we have no position, we'll support you if you do it, go ahead. And then instantly sent 400,000 troops and began bombing the country. Now, there's something to be said, knowing that the invasion and occupation began in 2003, we can never forget and never lose sight of the atrocity of the bombings and the sanctions prior to 2003, from 1991, when the war really started against Iraq, which continued unabated until 2003, where every single day the United States bombed and bombed and bombed. And what did they bomb? They bombed homes, they bombed hospitals, they bombed factories, and they bombed farmland, they bombed every single water treatment plant in all of Iraq. Now, this is not military strikes. This is not for some kind of defense of the United States. These were attacks directed at the civilian population, at its people, to make life so miserable that they could easily overthrow the government and install yet another figurehead that was to be a puppet of U.S. interests and the interests of its junior partners. And in addition to the bombings, the Pentagon generals said, the bombings aren't enough. We need to magnify the effects of the bombings. And so they sanctioned mercilessly the country, a country that was 70% dependent on food imports, which were completely cut off, a country that did not have access to basic medicines that were completely cut off. As a result of the sanctions, about 1 million people died. And 750,000 approximately were under the age of 5. And they died. These infants in incubators died because the United States government bombed all of the water treatment plants and then would not allow in the basic medicines to treat dehydration and diseases associated with dehydration. So these babies died from lack of access to water, not by mistake, not by collateral damage, but as a policy, as a plan, as a strategy by the United States government to unlivable and so horrific that they could impose their will upon them. This is the government we're dealing with. And I think, when President Obama told the world that we were to begin bombing Libya for humanitarian reasons, how dare the U.S. government even speak the words humanitarian intervention when they are responsible for one of the great atrocities of the modern era? Now, despite the horror of the bombings and the sanctions that carried out until 2003, they did not achieve their intended results, right? They didn't succeed in toppling the government and allowing one friendly to U.S. interests to come in instead. So, the 9/11 attacks provided a pretext. And we know that before 9/11, actually, when in the first cabinet meeting of the Bush administration, the invasion of Iraq was discussed with the new Bush cabinet, the national security advisors. They began planning the invasion and occupation of Iraq. And then 9/11 happened. And on that day, Bush and Cheney said to their security teams, intelligence teams, find some connection between Saddam Hussein and the 9/11 attacks. Well, we know, of course, there was none. But they said, find a connection, because they wanted a pretext. They wanted the people of the United States to support a bombing campaign and an invasion campaign. Now, of course, there was no connection, but it was something that was repeated so many times that actually polls that were conducted leading up to the invasion of Iraq, something like the majority of people in the United States believed that Saddam Hussein was responsible for 9/11, showing the power of the monopoly on information that the Pentagon has. So they had this pretext. And so in 2003, they told the world that it was in our national security interests, in the interest of national defense, because Iraq had these weapons of mass destruction. And when the intelligence was shown to the UN and to the people of the United States and to the world, Colin Powell and the Bush team, not only did they know that there were no weapons of mass destruction, but they knew that the intelligence that they were showing the world was completely false and fabricated. The war was for a lie. Now, I was a part of the invasion of Iraq in March of 2003, and believing very much that this was a war for national defense and for the liberation of the Iraqi people. But I don't remember looking for any WMDs in those first months. I don't remember the word even being uttered. Actually, I remember if you mentioned WMDs to any officer, they would kind of laugh at you, them knowing that's not why we were there. I do remember going straight for the oil fields in Iraq. I do remember people's doors being kicked down, men being dragged from their beds with sandbags over their heads. I remember children screaming. I remember people hitting us and telling us that we were worse than Saddam. I remember thinking that there was no possible way that this was a war of liberation. This was something else. Now, President Bush, just a couple months after the invasion in 2003, flew a little plane onto an aircraft carrier with a fancy flight suit and a nice banner behind him that said, "Mission accomplished." And he said, "The war's over. We did it. We won. No more Iraq war. We won." And actually, coincidentally, that same day, Donald Rumsfeld told the world, "The war in Afghanistan is over. We won the war in Afghanistan." Did it. Awesome. Well, this was this kind of imperial arrogance on behalf of the Bush administration. because the Iraq War was not over. And the myth that the Iraqi people wanted the United States to liberate them was completely shattered when Iraqis from all walks of life, from every town, every village, every corner of the country, heroically rose up and fought against the occupiers and nearly succeeded in driving them out. And the only reason that they did not defeat the U.S. military is, for one, that over 100,000 fighters in the Mahdi army were put on the Pentagon's payroll. The Pentagon said, "We'll pay you every month if you just stop shooting at us, please." And that's what they did. And two, the troop surge, implemented the most brutal tactics where there is all-out destruction and bombing, where any single person walking down the street could be shot and was shot with no consequences. So this combination of paying off large sectors of the resistance and essentially slaughtering people in areas where there still was a resistance is what caused this temporary lull in the violence. Now, Iraq today, the mission's changed, right? It's no longer Operation Iraqi Freedom, which of course is quite a ridiculous name. But there's a new ridiculous name, and that's Operation New Dawn, as they call it, right? That's kind of a nice ring to it. But the New Dawn for Iraq is a nightmare. Last year, there was a quality of living survey. It's a company called Mercer, Quality of Living. They did this very reputable ranking where they ranked the most livable cities in the world. And dead last on that list was Baghdad, the least livable city on the planet, due to its complete destruction of its sewage system, of its factories, of its schools, of its hospitals, of its museums, of its power plants, by the U.S. military. Now in Iraq, access to clean drinking water is extremely difficult. Nobody has electricity. Virtually anywhere in the country, maybe you're lucky to get 3 hours of electricity on an alternating basis. The Iraq War made, according to the UN, 5 million refugees, both displaced externally in refugee camps in Jordan, other countries, and internally, homeless. And now this is the greatest humanitarian crisis in the Middle East since the Palestinians were expelled from their homes in 1948. And those who are refugees are the survivors of a slaughter that killed over 1 million people. 1 million human beings are dead. Now this is a huge number. I mean, 1 million people is a massive number of people. Like I said earlier, the Iraq War is one of the great atrocities of the modern era. For the rest of history, this invasion and occupation will be remembered and written as one of the worst crimes against humanity that the United States has embarked on. Definitely in this decade. And those who survived, those who were not the 1 million or more than 1 million who were killed, have to live with the aftermath. Now, there was just much research done in the country regarding the massive amounts of infant mortality, of birth defects, of cancer rates, where in Fallujah, which was bombarded twice, where resistance was quite strong, and the only way the U.S. military could defeat the resistance was by blocking